Dr. Anton Shuvakin, who is the Security Advisor, Office of the CISO at Google Cloud. Hello, Anton.
Hello.
Dr. Roberto Bamberger, Senior Principal Consultant for DART, Detection and Response Team at Microsoft. Hi, Roberto.
Hey, Diana.
Great to have you back. And joining us from the last session, Brandon Evans, SANS Certified Instructor. Hi, Brandon.
Hi again. You know who I am.
Hello.
And needs no introduction, Brandon Evans. And AJ Yan, the founder and CEO at ByteCheck and a SANS instructor. And co-moderating this panel with me today is Ed Moyle. So we had a wonderful set of questions coming in pre-event, and I want to thank everybody for your deep and thoughtful questions. We had actually done a lot of time to prepare questions for you, but you came up with so many really wonderful questions that will be mostly focused on the questions that came in from the audience. We like to start with a bit of a thesis question, and Anton, I'd like you to kick us off, please, but then we'll go to all of the panelists for this question, our thesis question, which is around cloud security, not through the lens of a specific cloud, because a lot of our discussion today has really been looking at, let's take a look at Amazon, let's take at AWS, let's take a look at GCP, at Azure, and now let's knit together what happens for what we were talking about early when we've got this very cross-cloud, multi-cloud reality. The question is, how do you do security when you're going cross-cloud? And Leah in the audience actually asked this just beautifully, so I'm going to read her question. Shared responsibilities can vary across the multi-cloud ecosystem. How can we manage security responsibilities effectively in such a complex environment? So Anton, please kick us off.
So I'm not going to answer this question because admittedly, this is so tough to answer that there is no like crisp, pithy answer that just Anton is like hand wave through. But I want to start with a bit of a story. So the other day we were working with MITRE on something, and it involved detection across clouds. And the MITRE guy at one point said this: we try to write detection rules for certain threats that apply across GCP, Azure, and AWS. And we tried really hard, we gave it our all, and we completely failed. Because clouds at this level of detail are just different. So at a conceptual level, we can talk about how cloud this, cloud that, CSP this, CSP that. But when you get down to the details, in many cases, there is an Azure answer, there's a GCP answer, and there is perhaps even an Amazon answer, even though we have nobody here to voice it. My point is that there would be some concepts and ideas that are the same across the major cloud providers, minor cloud providers. Okay, of course, there's third-party control of the infrastructure and stuff like that. But when you get to details, things split pretty quickly. And the other day, I was reading a particular doc, and please don't ask me why, on Azure IAM. And I was like, what do these words mean? Like, I not only I didn't get the concepts, I didn't even know the words. Like, I didn't know what's a distinguished name. That's an example that's stuck in my head. Like, I had to look it up, and I think Roberto is waving because he clearly knows what this is, but I don't. And I had to, well, he doesn't. Okay, fine. Excellent. The point is that there's enough stuff in each cloud that you kind of have to learn to use it, which makes multi-cloud hard for that reason too. You have to kind of build the skills possibly 3 times. So that's why I said I'm not going to answer it, because I'm just going to give you pieces of a framework at best, but there's no like the answer how to secure multi-cloud. Push this button, multi-cloud is secured. There's no such thing.
Okay. Well, given that there's no push a button, multi-cloud is secured, Brandon, how would you advise the companies that you work with that they get a handle on that they are in all 3 clouds? They have to somehow normalize their security. And they're 3 different clouds with different terminology, as Anton pointed out. So what would you recommend?
Education, 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 practice, 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 testing, testing, testing. And I really appreciate Roberto and Anton from joining us to give us your perspectives as representatives of the cloud providers. I wish we had an AWS representative, maybe one a year. It's really just impossible to secure without that kind of practice, without that kind of education. I completely agree with Anton. So much different terminology. There is no button that you can press, and there's not even really an abstraction layer. And we were talking about this in the chat. We were talking about oh, Terraform is a really good tool that we could use to abstract concepts across the 3 different clouds. Have you used Terraform? Because if you use Terraform, you would know that although the language and the tool is cloud agnostic, the providers that you use to actually configure these different clouds are completely different. I gave an example in the chat of just creating a storage bucket. There's no abstract way of doing that in all 3 cloud providers. Similarly, there's no abstract way of securing your clouds. And I would love there to be an abstract API layer on top of all the other APIs. That will never happen because it will completely disrupt the market, because then there wouldn't be any vendor lock-in. And I don't think many people would be happy to see vendor lock-in go away in the cloud CSP space. So that's a big part of the problem for sure. So education and practice is really critical. I think people oftentimes say, oh, I know cloud security because I've worked in one. You don't. I don't. We're all learning. It's a learning practice. You'll never know it all.
Practice and learn. Okay. Roberto. Yeah.
I was just going to say, one of the other challenges is, you may not even know that you're using a multi-cloud solution because I just registered an OAuth app and I don't know what it's hosted on and what its model is and everything else. So understanding, the boundaries that we are crossing and how those boundaries are getting traversed, and then understanding within every, to me, I've been using the term trust chains as opposed to supply chains a lot lately, because we're implicitly trusting certain things, but we may not have any visibility into them. So this gets down to that whole understand what your attack surface is, understand what you're using, understand what you can monitor. If you can't monitor it, you can't secure it, and just doing the basics, right? But in my opinion, like I said, sometimes we don't even know we're using a multi-cloud solution, which I think also, adds just a little bit more to it, right? What are those containers? And what are the boundaries on this thing which we are allowing to interact with our data?
Yeah. Your SaaS provider doesn't always tell you which cloud they're running on. Yeah. Yeah.
Or it might
Chain
change.
stuff. Yeah.
AJ.
Yeah, I think everyone just has some solid points. It's so important to think about and remember that each cloud provider, there's just a different language. It's like learning a new language on each cloud provider. So I always talk to folks who are like, I know Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, and I just kind of chuckle a little bit. I'm like, that is really impressive that you know all of these different languages and understand all the things, because I struggle. And I've carved a lot of my space out in the AWS space, but I know a little bit about the others, but I never come off that I'm an expert. And I think everyone should go into multi-cloud understanding that you are learning 3 different languages to do things. But however, I do think in the cloud, one of the things that you can do is think about the buckets that you're concerned about from a security perspective: security governance, security assurance, IAM, threat detection, vulnerability management. All of these different key areas in the cloud will translate across the different cloud providers. And then you just start to develop your strategies in there. And really, the most important thing I would say is think about the risk. Think about it from a risk perspective. We often rush into security solutions without thinking about how does it impact the organization? What are the risks there? So if you are one of those companies that have a bunch of SaaS apps, understanding where they're hosted is probably where you want to start. Start thinking about the risks that are facing you instead of just trying to throw whatever security solution at the problem. And once you have that risk posture, you understand where you're at, you understand those buckets that you want to focus on, you can start to develop strategies on each cloud provider that are in those different languages.
But it is a very tempting kind of a siren's call to learn about the multi-cloud complexity and then go look for a vendor that promises to cover multi-cloud controls, like one of the startups that can promise some unification of controls, some security measures across all 3. And this is super tempting. And again, in my analyst days, we've been trying to tell people, hey, you should probably learn at least your primary cloud and maybe your secondary cloud if you're in 2, rather than just buy third-party tech that promises to cover it. It's a helpful route, but I don't think it's a shortcut to learning, but it's not a bypass around learning. You really can't possibly trust a third party if you don't know what it does on each cloud. So to me, I'm kind of positive but slightly nervous by people who say, oh yeah, I don't have time to learn two clouds. I'm just going to go to a startup that promises multi-cloud coverage of either CSPM or a bunch of other acronyms my former colleagues made up. Me and Gartner.
Well, great responses, all of you. Thank you for teeing us up really well. I wanted to introduce some of the specific questions that folks had, both in the pre-event Slack as well as also throughout the course of the day. And now that we've had a chance to kind of get a little bit into the nitty gritty, I wanted to maybe go a little bit more into the nitty gritty. And Brandon, not to put you on the spot, but since I think this might be kind of up your alley, I'm going to direct this one to you, which is Michael asks, and I'm going to alter the question just very slightly. So the original question from Michael was, what are the top 3 to 5 things a small company with extremely limited security resources should do when setting up and maintaining their secure cloud infrastructure? Now, I'm just going to tweak that a little bit for either small company or larger company that maybe has a smaller security team, or maybe there's a million things and different priorities, so they don't have a lot of attention to focus on. What are kind of the top 3 to 5 things they should be looking at?
I don't want to be a broken record, but I think a big part of it is training your developers and your operations folks. We can build a lot of protections around our applications, around the workloads that we're running in these cloud providers, but we're probably, as a security team, not the people clicking the buttons, writing the configuration, writing the infrastructure as code. We're probably giving high-level advice. Maybe if we have the resources, we can do peer reviews of what they are doing. So I think one of the most effective things that you can do is educate those developers, at least at a high level. If nothing else, just explain to them what can go wrong if you don't do security right. Like at a high level, just like why should you care about security? Now, I've had the immense pleasure of being a security champion at my previous employer. That is how I got into security. Basically, the deal was I get to go to a bunch of SANS classes and I get to learn a whole lot of things. And my only responsibility is to evangelize security to my development peers. And although, training is expensive, it paid off in spades, because immediately I was able to identify things that were obviously wrong and get other people to think about those same things. So I think that I guess to get to the top 3 things, a big part of it is IAM, networking, and probably encryption configuration. And the people who do all those things need to understand why they matter in order to check those boxes.
Great. Just one quick follow-up on the education piece. I mean, obviously, we're here at a SANS event, right? So SANS is a great educational resource. But they did stipulate, well, maybe maybe they're trying to do things on the cheap, right? Or they're a smaller organization. If somebody, if this is their big SANS thing for the year that is all that they have the budget to attend, are there other resources, just 1 or 2 high-level ones that you'd recommend, above and beyond, obviously, the cloud provider specific documentation that they'd be using anyway?
Certainly. Before I do that, though, I do want to clarify a couple things regarding what SANS offers and why you'd want to use it. I certainly would not recommend sending all of your developers to a cloud security training, and they didn't do that in my previous environment. They sent a very small percentage of those folks who could then evangelize those concepts. But we also
make security champions. Yes, make security champions.
Exactly. I don't think it's reasonable for you to send a development organization of potentially 100 people to SANS trainings every year. I'd love to see that happen, but I think that that's a hard sell for a lot of finance departments. We also have a lot of great free resources like the one that we have today. Outside of SANS offerings, we have the certifications and trainings from the big 3 cloud providers. You can get certified from them, and that is also extremely valuable. Their perspective is also extremely valuable. And there's a lot of other great educational resources that I'm sure you can find. I'm obviously very biased because I created one, but we're not the only game in town. We're just the best.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's start AJ with this, but if anybody else wants to chime in, and add some color to this one. NetSec NG is sort of touching on that. There are inherent cloud risks. We talk about that multi-cloud makes things more, difficult and complex. But specifically, what security challenges and risks are we creating when we go and as we actually the reality is as we operate in a multi-cloud world?
I think it's a lot of the same challenges you have, in the single cloud that we kind of talked about a little earlier as visibility. It's the idea that you probably don't know everything that's going on out there in your environment. So there's going to be some weaknesses that you might run into. And having that visibility across all the multi-cloud environments can be very challenging, especially for a smaller, less mature organization that doesn't have a ton of resources, can't spend a ton of money on tools, and they're just trying to get going. And I think as we think about what are some of those first initial things you need to figure out from a cloud security perspective, you got to know what your assets are. It's in all of the different frameworks. It's all of the different things. CIS Top 20 starts with inventory. You got to know what your assets are across the board. And in the cloud, assets are not just those VMs. You have all kinds of assets. You have the identities, you have the roles, you have the VPC, you have all of these different things that can be weaknesses and flaws that you might not know about. And then there's a concept that Kelley, the author of the course I teach, that we talked about recently on one of those free webinars that Brandon was mentioning about quick wins in compliance on AWS, the developer credit card problem, where you find out that there's some resources spun up in another region that you had no clue you had resources in. And now you have some attacker or some bad stuff going on in that region. So visibility to me is always the biggest thing. Whenever I'm talking to customers, whenever I'm working with anyone new, I ask them a very clear question up front. Do you know where everything is at? Do you know where all your assets are? And that answer to that question, if they're like, yeah, I know exactly because of the cloud. I just have CloudTrail on and I'm good to go. Probably not going to be enough. You probably need to have a more robust reason how you're seeing across your environment. And in multi-cloud, just 10x, 100x that problem.
Yeah. But at the same time, as we kind of touched on during my session and Dave's session, you don't have servers and closets in the cloud. If you do use the API, you will find everything. In that sense, if you know the cloudy way of getting resources, you'll get the correct resource. And of course, I did mention in passing that perhaps somebody from your org whipped out a credit card and bought their own cloud. And of course, there's a Q&A in the channel saying, well, okay, Anton, how do you find that? And that's much trickier. And this is where some of these tools for doing asset discovery start to look a little bit more valuable. Because while you can call an API and get all the assets, you can't call an API on what Diana just bought with a credit card because she needed some cloud computing on the side.
Oh. Roberto, I've seen your face as people were talking. I wonder if you have anything you want to add.
Well, number one, I agree with what everybody's been saying, that there's no easy button on this. But the thing also is we keep on talking about the cloud or a cloud. And sorry, at least I know within Microsoft's cloud properties, it's a completely different world if I'm talking about Office 365 software as a service, if I'm talking about platform as a service, if I am talking about infrastructure as a service, right? And the scope and scale of every single one of those. But I'm not 100% sure that the multi-cloud problem is really that much different from the on-prem multi-platform problem, where we've just had, we're just moving the complexity from one place to another. And, so, whether it was, okay, well, this database server over here has its own authentication subsystem or identity subsystem, you're going to find those things in the cloud because people lifted and shifted them. So really, I think we also need to be a little bit more precise. So like the question, that came in, I'm a small, medium business. I don't have a big IT staff. What should I be doing to secure my cloud? Well, my first question is, what kind of cloud are you talking about? Are you talking about 5 VMs sitting up there? Are you talking about why on God's green earth would I want to run my own email server and I just want an email service, right? So understanding those questions, I think we can give people better, more precise answers.
Yeah, Great point. And Brandon, I saw that it seemed like the whole multi-platform on-prem, multi-cloud really seemed to land with you. I wonder if you had anything to add.
It's just very accurate. And I never thought about it that way. I mean, you got multi applications. I mean, different systems that you have in the cloud themselves that interact in, yeah, it was a really good point.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that if you had it, but yeah, it was a great point. All right. Thank you.
All right. I think I'd like to direct this next one to Anton and Roberto for reasons that I think will become apparent. Stephen asked, what steps are Google and Microsoft taking to secure the supply chain in the cloud, especially with some companies using multi-tenant cloud infrastructures and different cloud providers? And I'd like to basically kind of draw this question out to talk about both supply chain generally, which is important, as we all know. Folks want assurance about that, but then also to the material that was covered in the mistakes or misconfigurations section, right, where there was the point about the software supply chain. So maybe we could start with Roberto and then go on to Anton for that.
And we got a softball question this time. I mean, so there's so many different dimensions of that, like from even the hardware that we run our cloud platforms on, our data centers, how we provision them, you know, where we source that. So there's an entire supply chain team at Microsoft, right, that deals with those pieces. I honestly don't think that customers need to be overly concerned about that aspect, because it's not going to target a single, you know, tenant or a single customer within one of our tenants. That's, you know, bigger scale. And if we have a problem there, we're going to have a lot bigger scale problem, right? But as I think about it, right, once again, it comes down to, you know, what applications are you using? What capabilities are you using? You know, what is the process? For example, if there's something in the Google store or the Microsoft or the Azure store, you know, where people can get a third-party application, what are the processes that are behind reviewing those applications, making sure that they meet some modicum of security, you know, conditions, and also then what are we as suppliers, as vendors, doing to monitor for abnormal activities, you know, associated with those pieces. I mean, it's a really tough problem. The other place, though, that you know, one of the seminal events for me in, you know, doing kind of these cloud investigations really was the Nobelium SolarWinds activity. It had a huge footprint on-prem, had a huge footprint in the cloud, and one of the scariest ones was where a threat actor was able to compromise a vendor that did an email backup solution and steal, you know, the private key for an X509 pair. And they were basically, they just had access to this secret and be able to go access, you know, all of that customer's, you know, data, the way that the whole thing was architected. That was completely invisible to the individual organizations which fell victims, right? So are we doing the right things to make all of these activities become visible? And how do we protect against those kinds of incursions? And probably the biggest thing there is, you know, how are organizations, how are software vendors, how are customers, how are we, you know, as suppliers, keeping our secret, right? At the end of the day, this is about, you know, making sure that, you know, we're protecting those secrets which enable access to everything. And that's, you know, one of the areas that we focus on the absolute most when it comes to making sure that the platform is indeed a place which people can have confidence and trust in. Luckily, you know, we go through it, Google goes through all these different certifications. You know, that really, the good thing is most of those processes really do review those pieces. And so I think that also helps you have a little bit more confidence in the integrity of the underlying platforms.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Yep.
Anton, from your point of view, what should customers know about from a supply chain or software supply chain point of view?
So funny enough, this kind of good news, bad news here is that we have a lot of stuff written on this by our Office of the CISO and by our CISO, by Phil Venables specifically. So I'm looking at a couple of really good resources that I'll share both in the chat and in Slack. But I'm actually not super close to supply chain, so instead of it's security. So instead of reading from a blog, I'll probably just drop the link to the chat so that it can be shared. This has been a huge focus pretty much from hardware up, and we're trying to build it not just for the stuff we built, but for open source software, for the components we use elsewhere. And of course, Google makes heavy use of trusted hardware as well, because if you start thinking about supply chain, you may think, whoa, wait a second, what about somebody who affects the chips before they are included in the cloud? And yes, we, and of course, our esteemed colleagues at Microsoft have to think throughout the chain to beyond the software in that sense, to hardware and metal. And this gets really tricky really, really quickly. And that's why I'd rather leave it to people who actually do that stuff, hence the links as opposed to a detailed answer.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Okay, so AJ, I'd love to start with you on this one, and then Brandon, and then obviously Roberto and Anton, please chime in if you want to add something. But BRAD asked a question about when an organization is adopting a multi-cloud strategy, how do we talk to leadership? How do we explain this to leadership about what they need to think about? And this made me think about something we discussed early, or AJ, when we were talking about what we wanted to cover in the panel. And you made this great comment about, some CEOs think that since they're using a SOC 2 compliant or a PCI or an 800.171 compliant cloud, that their whole company is compliant now. So what else should we be talking to leadership about?
Yeah, I think always the challenges with security professionals and leadership is they never listen. You tell them things
Easy,
ahead
right?
of time, and they're just like, oh yeah, whatever, until something bad happens, and then you get all the resources and budget you want after you get blamed for it all. So I think when you're having these initial conversations about multi-cloud, the first thing that I would try to have a discussion about is like, what are we trying to accomplish? What is our goal for going multi-cloud? Is there a reason for it? Is it to support customers? Is it because we just want to have more coverage and not be locked in on one vendor? Figure out what is the business goal, because the business goal will help you come up with the right security principles and solutions to secure those multi-cloud environments. To me, that's really important, is if you understand the business goal, you'll be able to come up with some really good security solutions. The second is like, clearly communicate risk. Again, like I just talk about risk a lot. I'm the compliance guy, so it's kind of natural, but you got to communicate the risk here, and you can't just say it's bad. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt, FUD, does not work with business leaders. That's what they think of when they hear security, and they see you coming down the hallway. They're like, oh man, they're about to scare me again. You can't do that. You have to talk about risk from a business perspective. How is this going to impact the business reputationally, financially, whatever it may be? Here are the risks that are facing us, and here's how they will impact us from a business perspective. And then you can have a really great conversation about all of the many things that you're saying that you're going to need to do, the more resources you need, the different teams, etc. But it has to start with the business goal, and it has to then you immediately translate, okay, the risk to those goals, the risk to the overall business is X, Y, and Z. And I think oftentimes security professionals start with security, which gets them kind of tuned out. Unfortunately, it's not, as security is becoming more and more important to the boards. We've seen some recent movements with the SEC requiring CISOs at the highest levels on the board representation. But it's still, we oftentimes are seen as the blockers. We're seen as the people that are coming with the bad news. So you have to be the best security professionals I know are able to translate security to business and speak in the business terms. And I think that's the thing I would tell anyone going into a multi-cloud. Don't start with all the multi-cloud stuff. You're going to scare people. You're going to confuse people. Start with the business. Figure out why. Why are we going multi-cloud? And then just work backwards from there.
Don't start with the tech.
Of course, this is good advice,
yeah.
whether it's 2022 or 1992. And I really hope that when we're having this discussion in 2042, somebody wouldn't show up and say, by the way, alignment with business is kind of important. And we're all like, yeah, you're absolutely right. And then somebody says, wait a second, we've been saying this for 50 years. how come the message didn't stick? And that's a good question. Sorry for the sideshow.
No, it's true. If you've been in the business for a while, as many of us have, it's like we've been saying a lot of this for years, and unfortunately, and it not doesn't always stick. Brandon, how do you communicate with leadership about these risks? What's your knowing you have to start with the business?
Well, I think AJ was a little bit too kind to leadership, saying that they don't listen. I think oftentimes they don't ask. If they asked early enough about our multi-cloud strategy, I may actually, frankly, dissuade them. Because I think a lot of people say, hey, let's get into multi-cloud for any number of reasons. But like Frank mentioned in the very beginning, we end up multi-cloud by choice or by chance. And oftentimes that decision is made by non-security leaders. They have all sorts of reasons for doing this, such as availability. If AWS, Google, or Azure goes down, you all never go down, obviously. So this is just a completely irrelevant concern. Or because people want to use specific tools, because all the clouds have some unique tools, or because they want to avoid vendor lock-in, which I think is a huge fallacy, as I mentioned before, because you are going to write cloud-specific stuff in whatever environment you are in. So I think that they need to ask more questions, let alone start listening. But obviously we want to front the business impacts to going multi-cloud and to secure multi-cloud. Trying to think if I have anything else to add, because I don't interact with leadership too often, but I completely agree with AJ that you want to start with the business risk, as well as the business enablers of going multi-cloud, because I think the availability matter is a pretty valid argument. But I do think that you should also separate this from having your application deployed to multiple cloud providers versus having different applications deployed to different cloud providers, because you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket from a business perspective. You may have like 30 different workloads and you could put 10 in one, 10 in one, 10 in one. But when you try to run your core application in all three cloud providers, that actually adds so many logistical concerns in my view that it's probably not worth doing. And maybe you could even dissuade them from going down that multi-cloud path in that particular area so that your security engineers don't need to learn how to secure this dang thing 3 times. They're having enough trouble solving it once.
You know, that reminds me back when I used to work with Roberto. I was the cybersecurity field CTO at Microsoft, and sometimes I would talk to people, to companies, and ask them, you know, they would say, we're not going to put everything in Azure. And I would say, okay, fine, you know, why? I said, well, vendor lock-in, as you mentioned, Brandon. I said, okay, well, what's your strategy? How do you decide what goes in Azure, what goes in GCP and AWS? And they're like, strategy about what? We just kind of spread it
What
around.
do you mean?
And I'm like, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that reminded me that a lot of you sound like they're doing multi-cloud intentionally, but frankly, in many cases, it just happens. And moreover, once I tried to do a Twitter poll by doing this kind of like a mental experiment, would CISO ever recommend multi-cloud on the merits? And I've been trying to beat on people all over social media to figure out, like, imagine you're a CISO and imagine this decision to go multi-cloud is given to you. Would you ever do it? And so far, I couldn't find even one who would say, oh yeah, it's for resilience. Like I wanted to hear it and I didn't.
Yeah. I mean, let's not underestimate, you know, that, like you said, it wasn't planned. I just bought a company because I needed this capability. And all right, now I got to integrate their stuff. So mergers and acquisitions, you know, also is how you wind up with a multi-cloud solution a lot of times. And then the question is, well, do I integrate them? Do I migrate them? What am I going to do there? So these all become, you know, strategic business decisions that, you know, the challenge, I think, for a CISO, for a security professional in an organization is really that, you know, that transformation of mindset, which Anton mentioned, which is, hey, how do I enable the business, right? As opposed to, okay, how can you give me your business requirements and I can go implement the strategy that says, and this is how you manage the risk of that, as opposed to being the land of no, right? I don't think anybody, well, I guess there's some government agencies which have made a decision to go multi-cloud on purpose. But in general, I don't think people make a conscious decision a lot of times. I think it happens to them.
I wanted to just hash something that Brandon said that I think we always have to think about from a security perspective and business perspective is the people aspect. Going multi-cloud will inevitably cause stress on your security engineers and the people that you're asking to secure this, because they might have to go learn a whole new cloud provider that they, even if you say like, no, it's no problem, we'll eventually hire. We care in the security industry. Like we're gonna be like, no, I got to go figure out what I'm supposed to do over here. And now you're asking them to expand skill sets to do more with less. And we have to think about the impact on the humans with all of our decisions, because behind all these tools, behind all these cool things, there are humans. They're just us, regular people out here that are trying to figure this stuff out. And I think it's such a great point that Brandon, you brought up, of that training aspect and that developing personal development aspect, that can be very stressful and lead to burnout for some of these folks that we have to think about and talk to the business about.
Absolutely. And to build off of that, there were 2 cases that we mentioned already about how you could become multi-cloud unintentionally. I love the mergers and acquisition example, Roberto. I give an example of that when I'm teaching Sec 510. I tell the hypothetical scenario in which we're in a boardroom and there's the board of directors trying to hear out this possible merger acquisition. And the business analyst gives A, B, C, D, E, F, G reasons why we should go with it. They've undervalued themselves. They're an important competitor, blah, 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 blah. And then the CISO shows up and says, yeah, but we're an AWS company and they're an Azure company. This is a lot of work. All right, that argument's not going to go anywhere. And then also we have the shadow cloud accounts, right? We mentioned earlier about how people will sign up with a credit card and get a new cloud account for a particular project. And honestly, I think it's even better or worse than that, because I think a lot of people take advantage of Google Cloud's very generous free trial to just get started up with that. And then later on, they add their credit card. Whereas AWS and Azure, it's a lot harder to get started up with from a trial perspective. So yeah, the developers and the security folks, it's a people problem for sure. There's only so much you can do about that, unfortunately, which is why you need to hire more people with multi-cloud experience, pay them a lot to solve that problem a little bit for the other people, because you're not going to train everybody overnight, and multi-cloud is unfortunately inevitable.
We used to, when we first bought a company that did a CASB solution, right? The sales motion was you go in and you ask the customer, well, what cloud apps do you use? And, oh, we only use these 4, right? Exchange, this, that, and that. It's like, give me your proxy logs. Oh, your people are using 5, the shadow IT discovery was tremendous. So when we talk about finding out what my cloud is, what my cloud usage is, don't underestimate, using a CASB solution against your proxy logs, and just to go and do that shadow IT discovery. You'll find there's all sorts of weird stuff going on, right?
Even DNS logs. I mean, you pair them
DNS
with
logs are
proxy
great too,
logs,
yeah.
and you get like even more magic.
Yep. I mean, customers have a lot of the data. They just don't know that they have it, and they're not leveraging it in an effective fashion to understand, kind of what their surface area is. Most of the signals that we wind up using a lot of times in incident response investigations weren't designed as security signals, right? They are artifacts of execution, which we happen to be now interpreting. I think, the things that Google does with how they, the security signals which they generate from that is amazing. I think, Azure, we try to do similar kinds of things. I know AWS does as well. So really leveraging the information that you do have so you can start making smart business-driven decisions as a CISO is a great area of opportunity for folks.
Absolutely. Great points. Excellent. All right. So I want to take this one maybe to AJ. One of the reasons this question really appeals to me is because there's an implied architectural element to it. So Tracy asked, what is the best way to prevent the cloud from being another entry point for hackers? Should it be viewed as a separate entity or an extension of our on-premise data center? So that's the question as written. from Tracy, but I'd maybe add to that, like, is there a preferred architectural strategy? Like, so for example, right, people, I've heard people say like, we absolutely have to have, you know, a transit VLAN for XYZ purpose, or, you know, is there like an architectural strategy that is better than others? Like, how should people view that from a practitioner standpoint?
Yeah, that's tough, and I'm gonna unfortunately give the audit consultant answer of it depends. You always have to kind of go back to the risks that you're facing and why you have that set up that way. Is there a reason that you need to have people from one side of the architecture accessing the other side, or do you not? Can you separate it? Is there a business justification to have it completely separated and locked down? So I would say, you know, you can't. It's similar to what we've all been saying. There's no one size fits all. It's really challenging to try to just throw something at a solution. You have to, it takes understanding the business, understanding the need there. Go ahead, Ed. I see.
Well, yeah, I was just going to ask a follow up to that. Like, so, and I hear that, and I think, you know, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's good advice, right? That there's no one side fits all, and they should, you know, do some homework there. But I guess I'm wondering, like, how do they start? Like, if they're trying to make that decision, like, do we approach it as an extension of our own in-house resources, or do we start from ground zero and build something new, maybe to address the sins of the past or for whatever purpose? Like, if they're trying to make that decision, how would they go about it?
Yeah, my opinion that I see folks kind of do, and you know, there's like those 4 different ways you kind of move to the cloud. You can lift and shift. You can kind of just blow it up and start from scratch. I think when people try to take what they're doing on-prem and just apply the same exact principles to the cloud, they lose out on a lot of the capabilities that you can do in the cloud. And you start to do things that don't quite make sense, like running a MySQL database on a VM. There's probably a server out there for you to do that on, or some kind of service on the cloud providers for you to do that without you having to like manage that infrastructure underneath it. So I would say take a approach to look at the cloud and how can you do things differently. Like you said, cover up some of those sins of the past that you have on-prem. But the challenge there that I would caution people is that if you look at it as a separate entity, you still got to protect that perimeter. Like it's still your perimeter of your organization. So you don't want to just say like, oh, because we're good here on this aspect of our network security, our perimeter security, we don't need to do that in the cloud. Like I would still draw the big circle around both environments and try to do all of the things you can to protect yourself, but do not take the same exact method you use to secure your on-prem environment and start it and do the exact same thing in the cloud environment. I just think you miss out on a lot of the great security services that are available on all the different CSPs.
And this question was asked multiple times. Can we do it as a starting point? And again, as a cloud purist, somebody would say, don't lift and shift. Lift and shift is stupid. Lift and shift is evil. Don't do it. But actually, we can say that, but results would be bad because people would still do it. People would think we are living in an ivory tower. Well, we kind of do. But the point is that this advice has to be more nuanced. And lift and shift as a first step is kind of almost okay. I cringe when I say that, but I know that the reality would barge in and say, Anton, it is okay. If we're going to do lift and shift first, push your VM up, and then kind of evolve to more cloud native ways, I take it. And again, they give me major flashbacks to my Gartner days when I had the choice to give customer advice like, don't do it. This is architecturally wrong. And Diana may remember that too, right? From the good old times.
Oh, yeah.
Or I would say, well, actually, yes, architecturally it's wrong, but given your realities, given your operational realities, your capabilities, your skills, it is a useful first step as long as you move off that in this particular way. So to me, this is why I stopped being a rabid anti-lift and shift fanatic, and I kind of accept it as a way to start, if not the way to go. Sorry for this brief interruption.
No, you're good. I think with that, Anton, I think the reason why a lot of cloud purists push back is because we know that if we're like, yeah, we're going to start this way, but then we're going to move to cloud native later, you're going to get told no later. When you start to try to make the decision, they're going to be like, oh, no, we're not doing that now, actually, because it's going to be too labor intensive. But to your point, I do like, I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I think you have to have a realistic approach to it. And that's why when you go to talk to people on the business side and just talk to other folks, you got to give them both options, express the risk on both sides of what's going on, and then really get a commitment that if we do it one way, we will execute the full plan to continue it after that.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, so Roberto, this one is for you, from Maria, but what I'd love is for Anton to chime in, and then for GCP, and also AJ representing AWS. And Brandon, obviously, if you have anything to add too, please. And the question from Maria is, could you please explain how Microsoft double key encryption actually works, and how encryption is, what types of encryption are offered by the different clouds? So if you could just explain DK at Azure, please, Roberto.
So I'm just going to be 100% honest, just like Anton was. I don't know. That's not my area of expertise. I can follow up and get details on that for folks. But that's not, I haven't had to go down in the weeds on how that particular piece of the platform works right now.
Okay. We stumped the expert.
So.
Brandon, can you?
I can briefly go with kind of our side of the equation, because it so happens coincidentally that I'm the opposite. Actually, I did deal with our equivalent of this through my data security engagement. So I can very briefly give a sort of our answer, if it makes sense. But I would refer, I've seen this question in the Slack, and I kind of referred people to documents. So the whole story started as people who want to use cloud in a more cloud native way, like they want to use cloud, but they want to make sure that certain data and the data is encrypted, and that the encryption key is not available to a provider like Google.
Right.
And your initial reaction would be like, what? That's impossible. But it actually is possible. And we had people who said, I want my key to be under this particular mountain in Switzerland in a particular store. And this is the mountain. Our encryption key is going to be there. And now make us use cloud as cloud natives. And so our engineering actually solved this problem by building a tech called EKM, External Key Manager, that it uses a lot, and I mean a lot, of technology to make it happen so that you can use cloud without giving Google access to encryption keys. And if you pair it to, say, confidential computing, you may end up with an environment where we don't know at all what you're computing. We can't get to the data. And moreover, nobody can compel us to reveal the data to anybody else. And this discussions sometimes happens in the hushed tones in lots of dark rooms. And I'm not going to go into details. You can read the public info on some of the blogs. But the point is that nobody can compel us to give this cloud info to anybody, because we don't have it, and we have no way technically to obtain it.
Yeah.
But the machinery, I'll keep I'll drop the EKM link in the chat again, and from there you can travel to various resources. But it's kind of something that, yes, it needs to be discussed by people with more depth.
Okay.
I think, or I should know the answer for the Microsoft double encryption, because it is covered in Sec 510, but a lot of things are covered in Sec 510. So it's very possible that I've misremembered. But my understanding is that all of Azure storage is encrypted with a key that is managed by Microsoft, just a general key. And then you can have double encryption where you specify another key that Microsoft manages that's separate from that one to do encryption. You can also do customer managed keys where you use the Azure Key Vault to doubly encrypt your data, because you can't turn off the initial Azure storage encryption. You can also supply the key material at the time that you're doing the encryption. So you supply it, it does the encryption, and then it goes away. And then finally, and every provider supports this, is client-side encryption, where you encrypt that data on the client side before you send it to the cloud provider, and you would decrypt it offline as well. It sounds really interesting that Google has created this solution that allows you to seemingly do client-side encryption while connecting the cloud to the client in a seamless fashion. That sounds really neat.
Yeah. And AJ, anything you want to add on how Amazon approaches this, AWS?
I'm gonna have to give the same Roberto answer. That's just not my area of expertise. I don't want to pretend to go there.
Understood. That's always.
I'm such a nerd that I can give the short answer.
Okay, thanks, Brandon.
There's also server-side encryption, also client-side encryption. You can also get a dedicated HSM if you don't trust AWS to have all your keys commingled with other customers, which I think is frankly ridiculous. And I can't believe that anybody pay all that money to have a dedicated HSM, but I'm not a compliance person.
Sorry for interrupting you. People push you harder than that. HSM where? If it's in your data center, imagine the Black Ops team dropping in your data center, stealing the HSM and getting the data out. People pushed us further. The HSM has to be under that mountain in Switzerland.
Yeah.
That's the EKM actually delivers that. So personal HSM for a client is not good enough for some people. If the cloud provider can touch the HSM, they want the HSM in their vault. Only then they accept it. So it's even more ridiculous. There's levels of ridiculousness that go beyond that ridiculousness.
Yeah.
Yes. And if I can get in one of my last shameless plugs in for the day, if you'd like to share with the SANS community how you're using your cloud, either sensibly or ridiculously, we just posted a link to the SANS 2022 multi-cloud survey, exploring the world of multi-cloud, where we're going to survey what security services that you use, what comfortability do you have securing various services, and much more. So just wanted to get that out there because we'd love to hear how many ridiculous requirements you were subjected to follow.
Well, there's always the balancing question of, customers want a lot of stuff. What are they willing to pay for? Right? It's like, and how much are they willing to pay for it? Like, yeah, I'll let you go run your HSM, in a mountain in Switzerland. How much extra are you willing to pay me to take on that additional load, right? If it's going to be a specialty thing. And so that's one of the balancing acts that we as cloud providers always have to balance, which is we would love to be able to do the absolute most secure, most maintainable, most interoperable solution, but we all have finite resources and we need to be able to deliver these things at an economic price point that's advantageous to our mutual customers, right? So that's part of the trade-off. No one wants to really pay for security usually. So
unfortunately, yeah.
It's true. All right. Well, I think we have time for maybe one more before we start to wind down. And I'm going to tie together maybe 4 or 5 different questions. So I'm not going to attribute this to specifically to somebody. This is a commingling of a bunch of different questions. Yeah, omnibus question, which relates specifically to threat hunting. So a lot of people have asked specifically about multi-cloud threat hunting, how to do it, right? Which I know is, I get it, that's huge, but for the folks who are curious about that and they're maybe looking for 1 or 2 hot take things to bring back to their organization to do from a threat hunting standpoint, what should they be looking to do?
Wasn't there a John Lambert quote about it? Roberto, you probably know it. He said something like, "Why are you people hunting before you collect logs or something?" I am badly mangling the quote, but it was something like that, right?
It came across, somebody quoted it yesterday and I can't remember the details
exactly,
either.
yes, that's right. That's what I'm trying to remember. Yes,
oh gosh. I swear it came across my feed. It was either Dave Weston or John Lambert that asked that. It's like, if you're not going to look at it, if you're not going to get the logs, right, if you're not going to get the data, then why are you starting off with hunting for things that you can't find, right? I don't remember the exact quote either.
Yeah, but the point is that sometimes when people ask the questions about multi-cloud threat hunting, it makes sense to grab them by the lapels and say, hello, are you doing detection? Are you even logging multi-cloud? So why are you bothering us with questions about hunting? How about you realize that hunting is kind of the ultimate advanced practice, which is sits at the very tippy tip of the pyramid of other practices. And if you don't do them or don't know about them, could you please defer the hunting discussion until we have log collection from multiple clouds? You have some kind of federated system or centralized, and then you do rules, and then you do threat intel, and then you do other stuff. And then, okay, Done? Let's talk hunting.
Yep. Well, I mean, it's the digital equivalent of eat your vegetables, right? You have to do the basics. If I can't measure it, if I can't repeat it, if I can't observe it, it ain't science. So if I can't see it, I can't detect it, right? If I don't know it's there, I certainly can't detect it. So even just understanding the complexity of my environment is probably step 0 in my opinion.
Makes sense. Thank you.
All right. I want to apologize to everybody whose questions we couldn't get to. We had so many incredible questions, and this hour absolutely flew. So thank you, everybody, for your comments, your thoughts. Before we wrap, I was wondering if I could get you to just one more thing. And Brandon, let's start with you, please. For the audience, whether it's going to be a next week, a next month, or a next quarter piece of advice, what's the one thing that you wish the folks here listening and attending this panel would do to improve their organizational cloud security posture or their approach to cloud security after we wrap?
I think the biggest thing, again, is education, but to be more specific, I would say education around default configuration. I think we talked about earlier about the shared responsibility model, but let's be real, because we want to make it easy for our clouds to be used by the largest number of people, a lot of those defaults are not so good, especially around IAM, networking, encryption, and storage. So I think those are some important areas to focus on. You can definitely do so by looking at Sec 510 or the free resources that are associated with it. And I'll do one last shameless plug, which is, as announced on one of the break slides, we have a brand new podcast that is coming out at the end of September called the Cloud Ace Podcast, where I will interview a lot of great security professionals from a variety of backgrounds on their journey to the cloud and their journey to try to secure the cloud. Anton is on the podcast. Roberto, you are formally invited.
Oh, yeah?
Just got your invite.
Okay, thank you.
We can talk online if you'll accept that offer, but definitely make sure to tune in starting on September 28th. I'd love to have you listen to me there and hopefully gain some more insights about how these clouds, they have a lot in common. They're also very, very different.
All right, so default configurations, and tune into the upcoming podcast where I think you'll probably have AJ and Roberto and Anton all on it. So AJ, your piece of advice.
Yeah, I would say define your desired end state. Figure out what you want that desired end state from a security perspective to be, and then figure out how you're going to benchmark against it. And then it's an iterative process. Like, you're not going to solve all your cloud security challenges on day one, and don't communicate to your leadership that you are either, because you're setting yourself up for failure. Figure out what that end state is, find a framework, find something to baseline it against, and then just build out what are the measurable deliverables that we're going to do to get to this desired end state. And then one other thing, I know you asked for one point. I just always in these sessions have to talk about the people. Think about your humans that are behind all of the decisions you're making. Cybersecurity burnout is so huge, and people are constantly, rotating out of this field because of the burnout. Because I don't think we think about people enough, and we think about the impact of our decisions on the people that are working behind all of these tools. So really think about your people, but really, to go back to your question, define that desired end state, and then figure out a path towards that desired end state for security.
As Jay Maskus said, how can you move without a goal? But also a great point on, let's not forget there are people running these technologies. Anton.
So I've been kind of scratching my head a little bit, thinking of like just one advice. Otherwise, I'll talk for 6 hours. So
Yeah, it's tough.
I would, and again, I don't want to also be truly self-serving and go recommend a podcast or something. Oh, I guess I can recommend ours and Azure's. Maybe that would be more fair. The point is, it's if you push me to the wall and say, Anton, you have to do one, I would probably say, go deep on the shared responsibility model. And I don't just mean print the friggin' thing and look at it, but more about, do you understand, for example, for detection, who does what? What does the provider do? Would you get alerts? Would you get logs? Would you get some telemetry? Would you get ready-made tools that you have to pay for? Would you get ready-made tools that you have to deploy somewhere else? I think the shared responsibility model a lot of success will still hinge on you understanding or not understanding that. So if it's one tip, yes, I'm super tempted to say avoid configuration mistakes, just like a previous speaker, but I would still say, sure, that's number two. Number one is truly get into the details of how shared dispensability works for you with your type of cloud usage and your cloud provider or providers, multiple, plural. That's where I would keep it.
And it's a great reminder. I think sometimes we hear words so many times, we're like, oh, I get that. But very few people really, really get what shared responsibility means. So great advice. Roberto, please wrap us up.
I'm going to go with a really unattractive, just eat your vegetables. You know, so many people want to do the exotic, right? But they're not doing the basics. So let's make sure that we're actually securing identities, that we're doing some of the basic hygiene things. And, you know, if you have a choice between complexity and simplicity, go for simplicity. Complexity kills security, right? It's just, I mean, Anton, you said it as well, that, you know, complexity just slaughters, you know, security. So let's actually get to places where we can understand the environments that we're using.
Well, and I mean, I know what you're saying. It may not be exotic, but your entire life is looking at companies that have been compromised and understanding why. So, you know, coming from you, that's incredibly powerful advice. So thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, AJ and Brandon and Anton and Roberto. We're so, this has been a great, great conversation.